Bonjour à tous. Merci infiniment.
Good morning. Thank you very much for choosing to attend this roundtable. It was a very tough choice. There is so much going on in these strategic meetings for the Mediterranean, and this year, just as for the previous sessions. I am very happy that FMES has agreed on talking about the religious questions, not only for Africa, as we are going to do, but more widely, globally in the world. Africa is a lab to consider those dynamics that can be found anywhere in the world and that interact with other aspects throughout the world. Religious questions have all too often been reduced to their most violent expression, spectacular expression, that is to say, Islamic fundamentalism that took the shape of extreme actions and terrorist actions throughout the continent. But it's a far more complex and varied phenomenon. Religions in Africa whatever their dynamics, have a number of common characteristics, whether they be associated with Islam or with Christianity. In the processes of identity affirmations that can be observed in Africa just as well as in the entire world, and including the way that patriotism and sovereignty have become the main engines for change. We have witnessed the return of conservatism, both in democratic countries as well as in more authoritarian regimes. Religion has become a way to affirm one's power, and in the relations with other countries and major powers in the world, religion has become a main subject, and in our countries, you can see consequences in our foreign policy, and we have probably underestimated the importance of that phenomenon. And for instance, the way that the US interact with the continent, not only at the level of the American state, but also with regards to more transnational relations and between the various churches, the way that evangelism and really well-structured religions acquired a new weight since, not only since the return of President Trump, but also anywhere in the world. And it can be seen in Central Africa as well as in West Africa, in bi-confessional states. We've seen the emergence of important and significant actors, and we witness that phenomenon in the Catholic Church as well, with the emergence of conservatism. We have in mind the cover of People magazine, Paris Match, and with that famous cover with featuring Monseigneur Sarah. So we can see links, also connections with Cardinal Burke in the US. And all this illustrates the current trends, and we can see commonalities between the various Christian faiths as well as the Muslim faiths in all their nuances. Islam is basically pacifist, but it supports some trends that question democratic or liberal values. I don't like the word Occidental values, but I used to refer to transatlantic values. But that system of liberal and democratic values, that is a system associated with a progressive vision of society and based on a very specific approach to issues such as gender or social organization and the place that our society gives to minorities, including sexual minorities. And all this is now questioned by a number of religious trends. So we are going to delve into those new trends in the course of this next hour and a half with our four panelists. Rodrigue Koné, anthropologist, and who's going to talk about the evangelist dynamics on the African continent. François Mabille is going to explain about how religion structures the international debates. He will also refer to the role of the Catholic Church on the African continent. Boubacar Ba from Mali will explain about how Islam is structured, including in Sahel, and the connections between religion and jihadist trends. And Igor Delanoë is kindly replacing another panelist who could not join us. So he's going to explain about an even less well-known dynamic, that of Muslim and Orthodox trends that are spreading from, including from Russia, and that are spreading on the African continent. And we shall begin with Boubacar Ba, who will be the first panelist, and then our other speakers will have the floor. Boubacar, you have 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Niagalé, for this presentation. And very briefly, I'm very happy to be here. It's the first time that I joined this event. I listened to the introduction, and I paid a lot of attention to the themes that were developed this morning. In my presentation, I first would like to say that since the end of the Ottoman Caliphate and the creation of the Muslim Brothers by Hassan al-Banna in 1928, since that happened in 1920 and 1928, it's the first time that we see the development of a new type of Islamic caliphate that we have witnessed over the last 15 years. We have the center of Mali with the Niger region and all the way down to the south of the country. There's the Multilaberi region in Niger, and there's the Sahel region of Burkina Faso. The regions are a genuine lab on the Islamic speech and doctrine and implementation. So the Sahel region is in this situation, and do they have the support of the Islamist caliphate? So the first question is that what are the subtleties of this form of Jihadism? And how, second question, how a country like Mali that's been traditionally an Islamic country for many years, 7 centuries ago, and with the Prefi and the Almohadid movement, there was always a process of exchanges between the Sahel and the Maghreb and different currents. But how a country with such a history could fall into the hands of the umbalist Salafist Wahhabite Islam? We have a polysemic conception that could be arguable, but there is that clear trend. Third question, how the Malian authorities, which are in a phase of transition and they have inherited a multidimensional crisis, do they have the capacity to stabilize the country? Or this Salafist Islam that is anchoring in the region? For the first time, we risk facing a situation comparable to that of Afghanistan or Syria. In terms of content, as everyone will know, Mali has a very rich history with the Foucaid Caliphate since 135. We have a very rationalized, very structured country, but we have not been able to build on the advantages of Islam. We have not been able to understand this movement, and we have fallen into a type of, perhaps not religious war, but really tougher stances around Islam. There are 4 or 5 different trends in Islam. There's the Malikite school, which is dominant in the Sahel, the Hanifa school, which is present in some other countries in the world, but not in Sahel, the Ashafi school, and the Ambalist school. So we have those 4 or 5 schools. There's also the Al-Badr al-Shit school. And this is a very interesting trend because we have some Shiite trends in the country now. The country was administered traditionally by the Malikite current trend since the 12th century. We had the Elijah Martel power, and since the beginning of the 19th century, the situation had been quite peaceful until the jihadist and Malikite trend developed. We had the Hadria current, the Brotherhood Sardine trend, and all that had always traditionally been together and had cohabitated together. Now, since the creation of the religion, the prophets, since the Abbasid current, the Fatimid current, or the Ottoman Empire, how did it change over time? Was there ever an androgyne Islam? And how was it structured? So the first issue was that apparently we were not able to fully comprehend the Islam. Now we have the Kufa trend, which really shakes Mali with its jihadist leader. And they've have been working in an NGO in Mali. This is extremely rich. Yadagali whom you named, is the leader of the Al-Qaeda movement in Sahel, and Amadou Koufa is his right arm in the center of the country. I just wanted to specify because not everyone here is an expert on this. There is in Mali, in the Sahel more widely as anywhere else in the world, a conflict, an open conflict between the armed branches of Al-Qaeda and those of the Islamic State. And it's a very ferocious fight between the two. And we cannot just tag them as a unified terrorist group because they fight each other. And they have different interpretations of Islam. Yes, so what we have to keep in mind is that our states, we were within the AES, we have sovereignty. We have never understood why. There is that issue with Islam. Every time a state is weak, jihadists take advantage of the situation. First of all, they work from behind the scenes. They infiltrate the state and they act on the basis of secrecy. We have seen this in other countries, in Algeria with the FIS movement, the Houthis in Yemen. It's always the same pattern, and it is based on two pillars: protecting and watching and penalizing. This is how they work, and it's been like this since the 13th century. What are lessons that we can draw from this? First of all, in spite of France action, Serval, Barkhane, Takuba, in spite of those programs, and in spite of the MINUSMA's actions, today, jihadist currents, Salafists, Wahhabites, all currents, the most fundamentalist current, the slightly reformist current, and the neo-Salafist current, all these currents, you can find them in mosques in Bamako. They are very visible, and they structure religion between mosques and training centers. They control the society. They have narratives that are a problem for powers, for our governments. We even believe that the jihadists promote violence. They infiltrate the states, and as of today, our states, as regulators, as moderators, this type of state is disappearing to the advantage of jihadists. How can we bring the Malian society? How can we lead them to understand the situation and how to fight violence in the absence of a debate as this one here today? In the absence of such a debate, there are some tensions in Mali. The situation has become very tense. There is no debate. Is it possible in the framework of AES, because our states went out of ECOWAS, so is it possible to define another set of values apart from ECOWAS values or Occidental values? We see our states stuck with the Salafist approaches. What are the alternatives? How are we going to manage the country? We may end up with the north of the country with tribal societies in the north of Mali, Niagalé, for instance, and there are other components. In the center, we may have a clan structure, and in the south, we may end up with a sedentary group with a different philosophy. So what can we do now? Jihad, as it exists now in the north, is promoting a violent vision. But beyond this, there's an approach that is spreading towards the center and the south. Amadou Koufa wants to promote an Islamist vision based on fear. And In the south, we have Benandaya, who is encouraging violence and fightings, road blockades in the south of the country. We are back to the Middle Ages in the country, and in the south, this person is promoting a feudal vision of the country. We have a state that was built on a democratic vision, but now this is becoming marginalized in the face of jihadist values. Now, we have those people dominating in Mali. We should focus on the Greek Platon or Socrates' vision. Now, I think there's another question here, the question of truth. Do we still have one truth? At present, we witness a number of versions of the truth, a number of truths, and people are making fun of the truth, and it became abnormal. Now we have those thoughts. Mali is at the crossroads now. Perhaps will anyone intervene, NATO or the UN, to save the country? We think that in the next few months, Bamako could be under siege. Will the Union of States, of African states, be able to solve this, or will everyone take arms and will we end up in civil war, which we don't hope? So the question is there now. Thank you. Thank you very much, Boubacar. This was a very dense presentation. You mentioned AES, the Alliance of Sahel States, created between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. So those states left the sub-regional region, which was ECOWAS, and ECOWAS was questioned. ECOWAS' role was questioned in the region just as much, if not even more, than the role of France or the international bodies. So the international order was questioned in the region. So this is what's at stake in the region. Igor, I'm turning to you as a transition, and you're going to have a different angle. We spoke about the role of Russia in Africa and those new trends that questioned the role of France in the Sahel region. But the situation is much more complex, and Russia is only back in the Sahel. Russia is not a newcomer. It may be so in DRC, for instance, in Central Africa, but in Sahel, Russia was there in the past, and as Boubacar said, Russia was there. There were many Russian speakers in the region. It's not been created from scratch by Vladimir Putin recently, and Russia was was able to play on the growing feeling of ultra-patriotism, ultra-nationalist feelings, ultra-conservatism in the Sahel region. It was a failure. The Wagner group sent by Russia has disappeared from Mali. It was recomposed through the Africa Corps, but we're not going to focus on this today. So Russia didn't have military success, and the Wagner group failed against the Tuareg rebels, if not faced to the jihadists. Wagner didn't have the mandate to fight jihadists, but they've been efficient on the front of informational tensions and fights. But Igor will talk more about it, and perhaps he will contradict me. Igor, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, Niagalé. Good morning. I thank the FMES for inviting me to jump in this morning to speak about this religious vector deployed by Russia in Mali. Few people talk about it. People are aware of the return of Russia in Africa, and we have Africa Corps or Wagner in mind. We have in mind disinformation campaigns and so on. But we don't necessarily think of the Orthodox Church or the religious tools that are being used. As a matter of fact, the Russian Orthodox Church is one of the Russian actors at play in Africa, so as to reinstall Russia in Africa, and I will come back to this. First of all, how did it take place? First of all, before 2019, the Russian Orthodox Church had 4 churches in Africa, and they were tightly connected to the Patriarchate of Alexandria. They were not autonomous. They depended upon the Patriarch of Alexandria. Orthodoxy in Africa represents about 15% of the world Orthodox. So it's not much, but it's not insignificant, and they are based on people in Eritrea and Ethiopia, where 40 to 45% of people declare themselves as Orthodox. But this goes way beyond those 2 countries now. In 2019, there was the autocephalic movement that led to the recognition by Theodore II of Alexandria, the Patriarch of Alexandria, of the autocephaly of the Orthodox Church. So there was a schism, so to speak, between Alexandria and the Russian Orthodox authorities. So a religious structure was created and institutionalized by the Synod of December 2021 in Moscow. So this was the path to autonomy for the Orthodox religion on the African continent. And they have gained weight since then. This patriarchate is structured around 2 dioceses, that of North Africa, with its headquarters in Alexandria, and that of Southern Africa, with its headquarters in Johannesburg. So 2 religious capitals, so to speak, for this African Orthodox movement. Figures are interesting because the the Orthodox just has parishes in various regions of Africa. The official figures of the Russian Orthodox Church are quite recent. We have 271 people in the clergy. Sometimes they are sedentary, sometimes not, because they need to be traveling around and reach out. In terms of parishes, the main countries of development are not Eritrea or Ethiopia, but Kenya, where the Russian Orthodox Church is the most represented in terms of parishes, with about 100 or so parishes. Second comes Madagascar, 3 Uganda, and 4th Tanzania. So it is not what you would have in mind, given the situation and the history with Egypt, Eritrea, and Sudan. Those priests, where do they come from, first of all? In majority, out of 271 priests, 260 are African. They have not been sent from Russia. Sometimes there are Russian priests traveling to Africa for main celebrations, but in this case, we are talking about African priests with who are trained in Russia in spiritual schools, and including on the basis of French courses and trends. They have the function of supporting mass, organizing baptisms, and so on. You can see them in Madagascar, in Uganda, Nigeria. Some new centers are being built. There is a very interesting person called Constantin des Aresques, who is the patriarchal exarch of this Russian Orthodox Church in Africa, and he travels around all of Africa. He went twice to Kenya this year, and every time staying more than 2 weeks for a tour of all the parishes. He had another tour just as long as Madagascar and in Nigeria this year. And sometimes he travels to other countries as well. They develop educative actions, including in the Orthodox School of Nairobi. And the Russian Orthodox Church is further developing in Africa and is opening up some monasteries so as to set up local clergy. Now, there's another vector, which is that of Islam. It has been underestimated too. Russia is also a Muslim country with 20 to 25 million of Russian citizens being Sunnite Islam believers. And Russia is also present in the Middle East, North Africa, and is presenting itself as an Islamic power. They have a siege in the Islamic cooperation, where they've been an observer for 20 years, and they interact mainly with North Africa and the Middle East.
This means that you have envoys that often are region leaders, leaders in Chechnya and in Tatarstan, sent by the Kremlin to implement good offices or to share messages with the heads of state and government in the Middle East. We've seen it in the Gulf with Saudi Arabia. We've seen it in the Levant as well, so this is an additional element that Russia mobilizes to try and promote its goals and interests. In Africa, for the moment, until very recently, we hadn't really seen this element being mobilized, and I've observed it for the first time in March when a delegation of Volga Muslims, mostly Tatars, went on mission to Niger to meet with Niger's Muslims. They met with an association called the Islamic Association of Niger, Association Islamique du Niger, to hold an inter-religious dialogue and discuss issues. This was the first time I saw this element being mobilized. It's hard to imagine in the Russian system as it is now that this isolated initiative wasn't taken in conjunction and coordination with the authorities, which means Russia can have an additional tool to reinvest the African continent. Another element, still in this Islamic religious component deployed by Russia, that's what I called gestures of piety. So again, I want to come back to Yunus. There's a vice minister for defense in Russia who is in charge of the Corps for Africa, and he went several times to Africa, Mali, Burkina Faso, Libya, Nigeria, to meet with a lot of the leaders. And last March he was in Libya for another tour, and he went and prayed to the Benghazi mosque. He was filmed while praying. I think it was in the middle of Ramadan, and those are messages, strong messages being sent, allowing maybe Russia to seduce, conquer new audiences. So what are the great takeaways from what I've just said? Firstly, a goal has been set by the Russians, that of creating bonds with the Africa's civil society. So Russians are very much aware that they cannot just rely on the usual bonds that link security structures and defense structures and African elites, because that could be a vulnerability in case of a putsch, in case of turmoils. You lose all of these bonds and then you have to start over again. So there is a need to create bonds with Africa's civil societies, and that has to go through the religious aspect. Second takeaway, this religious element stems from the fact that Russia is trying to present itself as a religious actor. We've seen it in the Middle East, in the Levant, in Syria, for example, and we see it in Africa as well. And that's something that distinguishes it from other geopolitical actors who cannot mobilize this religious element. Of course, France is unable to deploy this type of diplomacy. That's not one of its goals. However, we can see something being done similarly by Turkey. The Turks are sometimes very aggressive when it comes to the religious field. And some other countries as well do it through various associations in Sahel and abroad. This element is completely new. Of course, for the USSR, it was out of the question to mobilize this tool. So this is a new tool that the Russians have learned to instrumentalize and to use. One last point. The Russian Orthodox Church is another tool to use to promote conservative traditional values which resonate a lot with African societies and, of course, are in complete contradiction with the Western values in these countries, that the Western values are not being well received by a lot of Africa's civil societies. Thank you very much, Igor, for this excellent presentation. And thank you to Boubacar as well. So here's another presentation which will be as excellent. Our panelists have been very well chosen. Let's give the floor to Rodrigue Koné. I don't know if it's going to be as good as Igor's presentation. I've just learned a lot on Russia's perspective and the Orthodox Church's approach in Africa. And that allows me to transition to the evangelical movements that are also constantly participating, playing an increased political role in making the African societies post-colonialism. I'm not going to generalize to all of Africa. I will talk about the cases that I know best. Western Africa. Maybe we should come back to the end of the 19th century to understand what happened, colonial conquests, to understand, to see the very beginning of evangelical movements coming from the United States, to understand this strong role that evangelical churches play. When I talk about evangelicals, there are several actors with various practices and spiritualities, but they have one thing in common. They try and distinguish themselves from the Catholic religion, from the Catholic Church, which was almost a participant in the colonial period. So we have to wind back to that period to talk about a very interesting initiative of a current that we called Harism. That's a syncretic church, in a way, that tried to use the Christology speech, but make it adapted to African practices and traditions, and it was promoted by an evangelical predicator called Harris, coming from Liberia. I think it was in the 1890s, 1893 to be more specific. And that leader, that religious leader, was none other than quite a subversive political actor. In Liberia, maybe you remember that Liberia greeted the descendants of slaves, and they built a state in Liberia. And it was in majority Pentecostal evangelicals, but he was from a different branch. So Harris, with these churches, with these parishes, he understood very quickly that there was a colonialization process at stake, at play, from these black slaves that had come back and paradoxically wanted to force their own culture onto the local population. So he rebelled against the local Liberia elites at the time that were Pentecostals, and he fought against them with several of his friends to make sure the locals would get the power back. It didn't work, so he was sent to jail. And then I think it was the second time he was in jail, he realized what he needed to do was to create a new religion. But that new religion is based very much on the Pentecostal evangelical practice. And when he left jail, he went to Côte d'Ivoire, crossed the border, and he started working as an evangelical with local communities. But in his evangelical speech, in his Pentecostal vision, he added the logic of anti-colonial struggle, and he added the way that you can fight colonialism by accessing school, by inverting the civilization order that colonizers were suggesting, by creating political actors. And that work was done in less than 18 months alongside the border with Côte d'Ivoire. But the paradox is that it also woke up the nation and allowed him to mobilize actors that would later on oppose the colony once the 1914 war started, when they tried to mobilize a war effort. Locally, we understood very quickly that Harris's doctrine had created a resistance to this movement. So that's a very specific chapter in the decolonizing process. Evangelicals and widely religions have always played a really important role in moments of schisms, of ruptures in African societies. And now I would say that important moments of ruptures, like democratization processes in the 1990s was one of them. Back at the time, evangelicals also played a very important role with their speech on the theory of prosperity. They managed to mobilize populations that were precarious, that were populations that had been impoverished by the official system. And for political opponents, it was ideal. So evangelical actors have always played a really important role to mobilize communities, including when they needed to discredit local elites. All their speeches on the need to fight against corruption, on the need for a renewal, were speeches that were being shared, messages shared by evangelical actors in churches to start with. What's at stake currently in the religious field? And I'm going to end on this. What's currently happening in Africa, and we've heard really interesting analyses this morning on the changing global order, on the de-Westernization of the world. In this process, religious actors play a very important role. And not just evangelical actors. But for example, let's take what's happening in Sahel. With, let's take the specific case of Burkina Faso. Captain Traoré, the leader, managed to build his popular legitimacy That was a legitimacy that was at the margin of traditional power. The power elites, the traditional elites, were fundamentally Catholics. And he managed to base his legitimacy on religious systems that were marginal systems, like Wahhabi Muslims, but also based his legitimacy on evangelical movements that were, yes, Christians, but were set to the side by Catholics. So he managed to manipulate all these identities, and he managed to mobilize to make himself legitimate as a political actor. And aside from Catholic groups, we can also see that there's a general message talking about a return to the magic and the religious, a return as well to what we could call African religions. It's very interesting to see how the General Assimi Goïta is currently rebuilding his political legitimacy while resorting to traditional religions. He's even created a school of wizards, a university of wizards, which is almost brand new in the most important neighborhood in Bamako, to show the way religion is a tool to fight against Western imperialism and helps build a sovereignty tied with more traditional religious movements that are at the margin and aside from imported religions like Islam and Catholic religion. So to conclude, I think the religion is a major element in the way that African societies renew themselves, in the way that African societies confront global turmoil. And we cannot understand this renewal, this adaptation strategy to a changing world without understanding the role and the presence of religious actors in Africa. I think that African societies have mostly been built around political actors, religious actors, and sometimes economic actors. In all cultures, we can see that religious actors, or the person representing the religion, is always an important actor nationally, and I don't think that's an exception. I think it's a universal phenomenon. It's an anthropological phenomenon in Africa and outside. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rodrigue. And I will now give the floor to François Mabille without further ado, and then I'll ask you a few questions. And of course, I'll give the floor to the audience after that. Thank you very much. What Niagalé had requested of me initially was to give some key takeaways on how religion works globally and more specifically in Africa, and maybe if I had enough time to also share a few words on Catholicism in Africa. Before I broach the African continent, I wanted to recall one or two elements of the way religion works, because we are in France, and in France we have a specificity, which is that we do not understand religion, or sometimes we interpret it through a political and historical culture that is very specific, which means that very often authorities, public authorities in France do not manage to understand what's happening in this field. We have a French approach, which, in our memory, means religion is what divides us, is what creates conflict, and what's religious is something that's private. Unfortunately, things do not work that way. It works barely in France, and as soon as you exit, you leave the borders of France, it doesn't work that way, whether it's in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa. First thing I'd like to recall, when we work on religious aspects, we use a notion coming from Italy, There's religious integralism. It's not integrism, but integralism, meaning that religions aim at the integrality of life. That means their aspects are about the entirety of life, whether it's political, private, social relations, including international relations. And it is the case for Islamism, for Protestantism, for Christianity as well, and for Islam. I wouldn't talk so much about Judaism in the same way. But for other religions, that's the way it works. And when you talk about an entirety, a global vision, it means that there can be a vision on society, a vision on, or an idea of how relations between states should work. So religious actors have an idea about this, meaning that based on their norms, on their standards, and based on these norms seen generally as superior to political norms, they can make assumptions. I will use an expression used in other contexts. The map is in the territory, and the territory is in the map. It works perfectly when we talk about religion and politics. When Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989 started a fatwa against Salman Rushdie, what did he say? He said the religious is superior to the political, and my religious map is not your territory, meaning I could be in Iran, I could start a fatwa against a citizen who is outside of Iran in another country. Two more examples can be given. Same idea when Benoit XVI, Pope, received some European deputies, and he said there are some non-negotiable principles and you have to vote based on your Catholic consciousness and not just as members of a political party. What he says is religion is superior to politics. There are non-negotiable principles. Another example again, and let's talk about Pope Francis. Pope Francis comes to France for the French, but he doesn't say, I live in France. He says, my religious map isn't your political map. According to my map, I travel through the Mediterranean territories, and I choose a spot that I think is symbolic from my own perspective of international relations, and I will pick Marseille as a symbol of everything that was mentioned this morning, and it could work for Toulon in the same way. Similarly, when the Pope travels to Strasbourg, he still does not say that he's coming to France. He says, I am traveling in Europe and I choose a symbolic spot of European identity and construction, and he picks Strasbourg. And again, my religious map isn't the political territory, but we could say it the other way. The religious map isn't equivalent to the religious map and political map. That is the case for the entire world, including for Africa. So that was my first point. We have to understand that religion touches upon everything. And second point, in religion, social relations are important. Very often, religious actors are social actors, all the more so when l'état de providence is in crisis. A few years ago, we did a research that showed that religious actors progressed even more so when the welfare state was in crisis. So several countries, several African countries, several Muslims back in the day it was Egypt, now it's other countries. You know that in failing states, you have actors that will be mobilized, social actors, who will act either against the state or with the state, but they will play that role, that of a social actor, social leader, and that's a very important point to understand. Thirdly, as I said, very often religious actors are seen in France as polemical actors, and I'd rather keep in mind what Scott Appleby has said, a friend from the US. He talked about the ambivalence of the sacred, meaning the sacred is potentially polemical, but not only, it's also social bonds. It's also about religious actors that are giving meaning to societies and life. And since the Cold War, they've built their ability to host, to greet, and that is one of their assets. Another example, the book that Oxford wrote on religious actors is called the Oxford Handbook on Religion. it talks about conflict, yes, but also peace building. Religion, conflict, and peace building, meaning religion touches upon the entire spectrum of security. That being said, let's come back to Africa. I have 3 main points, very briefly. Firstly, following what I said, let's remember that religion works on a different timeline. Since the end of the 70s, we've had 2 different timelines. I think we've just opened a 3rd timeline, first timeline. And remember what was said this morning during the first session. That was back when the states were still strong. At the end of the 70s, religion came back on the international scene with Afghanistan and the way that an Afghan Muslim resistance was built with the help of the US against the USSR. Back then, we also had the Iranian Revolution, which is a revolution supported by religious actors and also a revolution against Western values. We also have the seizure of the Mecca and also the arrival of John Paul II in power. So the idea that religion and politics can be opposed forces, which is the case as well back then in Poland. So first timeline. Second timeline, the end of the Cold War. And what's been created after that, for the moment, globalization. Globalization, what does it mean? Globalization means religion has been globalized as well. The globalization of religion in Africa is the same as it was everywhere else, meaning there's been a privatization of faith. There are as many believers than faith. I'm exaggerating, but it's almost the case. Let's take an example. Trump qualifies himself as a Christian, but a non-denominational Christian, a non-defined Christian, meaning at the moment there's such a diversity of Protestant churches, and that's the case in Africa, but elsewhere, that you can tell yourself, you can say that you are a Protestant, but not pick a specific branch. So you can make your own mix of the religion that you like. Second aspect, various territories. What do I mean by that? In Africa and elsewhere as well, religion and urbanization act in parallel with a new forms of religion emerging precisely because they appear in cities. And additionally, we also have the phenomenon of diasporas. So religion travels from one city to another, from one continent to another. And related to that, and that's precisely what Igor was talking about, we also have an internationalization or a transnationalization of religion. And that's the case for the entirety of religions, for Islam, for Christianity, for Protestantism. So I would add a 4th point that was mentioned by Rodrigue a second ago. In Africa and in other continents as well, for decades now, but it's more obvious now, we have a great return of traditional religions. And these traditional religions can be fought by the main monotheistic religions, but they are quite important. I'm talking about shamanism in Latin America, or even Druidism in Brittany, to scare some of the French. Druidism is coming back in France, but there are also a lot of other examples that I could mention elsewhere, and that is the case in Africa as well. You have more and more traditional, African traditional religions that now request to be taken into account by states, by heads of state and governments. And now, I think that in order to understand the geopolitical issues and religious issues at stake in Africa, we have to keep in mind 3 things. First thing, there's a readjustment of politics and religion, which is happening as well internationally. We've talked about Trump and the Christian right, Putin and Moscow's patriarch. We could talk about Modi and Hinduism. We could talk about Erdogan and Islam. We could also mention, in this case, Bolsonaro back in the day and the evangelicals. We could also take as an example Hungary or Italy. Poland, any country, it is working in the exact same way. We can see that religion is being used for political goals, or sometimes there is a tacit agreement or even explicit agreement between religious actors and political actors. It's the case in Africa. We can see various examples in Uganda, for example, with evangelicals. You will find it as well. We've talked about it in Ethiopia, with again that question of territory being raised because there's an internal conflict. It's the case as well in Nigeria. In Nigeria, in multiple ways, between the Nigerian government and several religious actors, and between the north and the south as well. And that's where we have to be very subtle, because we are trying to talk about the main trends, but as soon as we talk about specific states, we have to be very precise, and it's never the case in any, it's never the same thing across countries. Same thing happening in Senegal. And we could give more and more examples. In every one of these cases, we have a readjustment of the role of political and religious actors that find an interest. Sometimes it can be a symbolic interest, maybe showing that the religion is an element of the memory of the state. For Ethiopia, that's the case. It could be also about recognizing that a religion helps living together, helps a certain type of social homogeneity. It could also be about recognizing that it promotes purely financial and economic interests. In many of the examples I've given, it would be very simple to show that religious actors that have signed agreements with political actors have done it for economic interests, including tax exemption. When the Holy See signs in 2016, if I remember well, an agreement with the Republic of Congo, you can read the framework agreement and you can find a paragraph on tax exemptions. Same thing in 93, the Holy See signed an agreement with Israel, and that issue was also mentioned in that document. In Senegal, you can look at the role played by several churches, and again, it's about tax exemptions as well. So I would say that's the first thing we have to keep in mind to understand the issue at stake, understanding how religious actors and political actors are reconfiguring their roles in Africa and elsewhere.
Second aspect, how religious issues become a factor of influence, and such is the case for the Orthodox example that you gave, but there are other such examples. How state actors in Africa use religiosity as a factor of influence in Africa and also outside Africa. A few examples. In Africa, you cannot understand present changes if you don't understand the role of Morocco and the Mohammed VI Institute for the Training of Imams. And about 100 or so Orthodox representatives are being trained now in Moscow. We could also mention the influence of Egypt, including through the influence of the Al-Azhar University, or Nigeria, or Ghana, through their pan-Coptist networks. You have some factors of influence in Africa on the basis of religious approaches, and they also have an influence outside Africa through a religion, the religious soft power, including in Europe and Asia. There is the Egyptian example that spread in Asia and Europe, and there's the example of the pan-Coptist Nigerian churches, which are very powerful both in Europe and in America. And this is a very interesting aspect because you find it in the Catholic religion as well. You mentioned some north-south trends, but the missionary current now tends to go the other way around, and this is particularly true for Catholicism. I have a colleague working on the presence of African priests in France, or more widely in Europe. The missionary trend is going the other way around now, and same goes for a number of Protestant churches. So Nigeria is one of those countries that are acquiring more influence internationally through these networks. Secondly, we have non-African state actors that use religion so as to promote their influence in Africa. We have named a number of actors, including the Moscow Patriarch representatives. And if you follow the travels of Putin and Lavrov, and you will see that among people accompanying them, you will find Patriarch's representatives. You have Turkey as well. You also had the example of the U.S. through USAID and the support it gave to religious actors, including evangelists and Pankhutists. But as Mr. Trump cancelled fundings to USAID, we start to see consequences of this. You also have the example of two other actors having a significant role in Africa and elsewhere, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who fund the building of mosques. It's the same pattern in all religions. There are commonalities between Islam and Moscow, between the way they build churches, train elites. These are the same strategies that are implemented in all cases. There are two other types of actors that are to bear in mind. First of all, religious NGOs, in connection or not with state agents. The first few NGOs in the world were religious bodies. They were called World Vision, which was a Protestant NGO in the US, and Caritas Internationalis, known in France as Secours Catholique. So these NGOs are present in more than 180 countries in the planet, with huge budgets and huge capacities. And they support and sometimes replace states, including in the aspect of welfare states. Now, the notion of armed groups that act upon religious grounds, and you can witness this in Sahel, but also from East to West Africa, and with a North and South extension that is appearing. So you can see that religion has become a social structure and a political vector in Africa as well as in other countries. Thank you very much. I think that your presentations helped our French public to fully grasp that dimension that is absent from French diplomacy and from the way France acts in the international spheres. So we tend to ignore this in France. However, it's at the very heart of diplomacy in the world, not only for the most powerful countries, but also within the various African states, as well as others. Now we have only some 20 minutes left or so, so I would like to ask all of you a question that has not been touched upon. What about the role of those actors in peace initiatives? We are facing a very conflictual time, and Israel is playing an active part in in changing the face of a number of conflicts. Religious actors are extremely present on that scene. I was last week in Sciences Po, in the University of Sciences Po, and I attended a meeting where Cardinal Obambo was present, and he made a speech on the role of protest, not only social protest, but also political protest in DRC, where the Conference of Bishops used to be a major actor to fight against the confiscation of power by Joseph Kabila. And even though actions are less apparent, there's also actions such as that of Lisa Sekedi. Now you have the floor to answer this question. We should enlarge our vision on this. And if you want to fully grasp the role of religious actors, you've got to keep in mind the multi-track diplomacy. That is to say, the diplomacy at the various levels. It was a notion by some American authors, whereby if you want a peace process to work on in the long run, you need to take into account a wide number of actors, whether it be international institutions or state actors or private actors, including religious actors. And when it works, this is how it works. We could give the example of Mozambique in the past with Santa Reggio, or the case of Colombia with the agreements of 2016, or a number of docars in Africa. And this is true for all religions, including in Sahel, where you have some imams that are trying to promote peace. It is true for the Catholic religion as well, with a specificity, however, because Catholicism is at stake internationally and nationally. Internationally, because you have the Holy See and its diplomacy, and nationally, for instance, in the DRC case, when you have the Catholic Church that mobilizes, and when the Pope goes to DRC, he tries to promote some action as he did in Sudan. So you have some actions from local actors that can vary from one place to another. In the times of Kabila, there was the Monsango Cardinal. He was one of the major opponents. He was not a political opponent, but it was a religious opponent with a religious dimension in Kinshasa. So perhaps it's more subtle. But one last important point. When you differentiate between the religious and international policy, Obongo was the one who supported the diplomacy of Pope Francis in DRC, but he also was the one who killed François Francis on issues such as homosexuality or same-sex couples. In his own name, as well as head of Episcopal Conference in Africa and Madagascar, he said that in the name of our African culture, we said no to you. And that was the last moment in the pontificate of Pope Francis, a few months before he died. And it was a major failure in his pontificate. So there was some opposition. And when you talk about transnational actions, I have in mind the picture of Pascal Ossol earlier on. We have geopolitical oppositions with respect to the geopolitical organization of the world, but you have also conflicts in value. And what's at stake today is to know if the war of values is also a war of civilizations. You have Burke in the US, Obongo in Africa, and Sarah. You have the same fight, but Sarah, Burke, and Obongo have the same approach as Patriarch Kirill. They have the same approach. If you read the speech of J.D. Vance and the speech of Pope Francis when he went to Hungary, you can see the difference. In terms of value, there's no difference. Now, the differentiating aspect is that of the order of the world and imperialism, but it makes it difficult to grasp the global picture, but you can see a permeability of religious questions and state questions. I'd like to add a few words on this. When you talk about the role of religion internationally, you touch upon the question of values, and all too often you hear that there's a return of personal interests on the international geopolitics. It is quite wrong. We tend to consider that values are only values of democratical liberal soft values, for instance, human rights, democracy. But no, values are also conservatism. They can also be ultra-sovereignty. And this is what we are witnessing. The American diplomacy now is not grounded on interest. It is grounded on promoting a model of society that is close to that of Kirill or the Orthodox religion. Conservatist Islam is totally in line with the non-liberal vision of a society that is promoted by those religious actors whom you tend to consider as less dangerous, and quite rightly so, because they don't pick up arms, contrary to what Islamist extremists do. However, in the US, you can ask the question now, but I would like to focus on the role of values in geopolitical recompositions at present. So it's not just about interest or hard power.
I would say that the question of values is one thing that unites religious military regimes as well. We see it in the Sahel, in Niger specifically, all laws being promulgated against homosexuality, the suppression of the family code. That is something that remains at the core of the readjusting, rebuilding of states. And in an anti-imperialist goal, in an anti-Western goal, as they affirm it, that's what they promote. And let's talk again about the role of religious figures. They are keys in Senegal, for example. The marabout, for example, the most famous ones, are at the heart of all the Pacific revolutions happening in Senegal. They play a role that I would call over the state. And sometimes they even scold political leaders and heads of state. We also see that in Burkina Faso, Noro Naba, the traditional chief and important key religious figure, played an important role in the negotiations and in the way that the coup is evolving and happening without any blood being shed. So they often play a role of a pacificator. They make things more pacific, not always, of course. Political actors are also of various religions, and they have various conquest strategies and try to mobilize marginalized religious actors to try and bring them back to the system. But yes, they are being used to reinforce legitimacy. That's a very interesting question. We don't have a lot of time, but the question that's at the heart of the debate in Mali, I said that last Friday I discussed with a key figure in Mali. An inter-Mali dialogue was started, and it led to a charter for peace and reconciliation. And I think we should follow closely the work being done on this. Even if the youth doesn't believe in it, I think there's something in this charter. Recently, I participated in a debate on the alternative management of conflicts. Mauritania has an interesting approach when it comes to that. It's been, I think, 15 years that Mauritania has been spared. Why? Because they have Al-Nutaraka. This is a dialogue with the jihadists. Everyone knows about it. They pay money We don't know how much, but they pay money to them to calm things down. Algeria also decided on the civilian accords. And recently someone told me, he's written a book that will be published in a few months, in December, I think. He said that in spite of what happened in Syria, until the end, there were negotiators coming from Saudi Arabia to calm the Algerian society down and to find a way to work with religious actors. But for Mali, I would say one thing. Let's hope it works. Within 6 months, we should be finding an alternative to stop this caliphate alternative. But the difficulty is that this dialogue that was led in Mauritania, Islam is the majority religion, but we are in a state that's not religious. But in our country, the Salafists contest the legitimacy of the state, and there were even actors in mosques being trained in various Arab states, and they're very violent. And what I fear is that we might end up with an interconfessional, interfaith state with a dominant majority of Salafists. So if we want to save Mali and save Western Africa, we need to act. Rodrigue said earlier that Senegal was crucial, but I think right now the powers that be in Senegal seem to be flirting with a Sunni group called Ibada, but they are Salafists, just disguised Salafists, and in Niger that's the same thing. So let's be aware of this. We are not only talking about political turmoil and coups, but also religious turmoil that would have an impact on international relations the world over. I fully subscribe to what was said when it comes to interests versus values. That's not what we should be talking about. Values are still an element of influence for many actors at the moment. This morning, during the introduction, we heard that we were going through a de-Westernization of international affairs. We've been talking about it for 25 years. It was Primakov at the end of the 90s that already set the foundations of this notion. But the issue is not so much within the values, but the way they're interpreted, they're instrumentalized, and they're applied. Often what's being said about the Westerners in Russia and in Africa is that for a long time the Westerners had the monopoly not so much of defining the rules, but interpreting the rules. Defining the rules was done internationally, but interpreting it in a very asymmetrical way. And that has done a lot of harm to the credibility of the Western world, and we've seen it more and more these last few years. When it comes to the peace diplomacy of the Russian Orthodox Church, I'll be very brief. It is acted upon, or it is mobilized by the Kremlin. It was mobilized, for example, when there were conflicts between Russia and Turkey. Sometimes Turkey could serve as a platform of dialogue with different actors. There's an interfaith dialogue between the Orthodox Church in Russia and the church in Iran. And, for example, they agree on being hostile to the West. They agree on several things. Russian Orthodox can be used as messengers, as I've explained. There's one thing that has worked really well these last 10 years, or 10 years ago when there was a war in Syria. Russia was designed or called the protector of the Christians in the East. And it's put the Russian state in a delicate position, because when it was trying to promote a dialogue between Syrians, the Russian state didn't want to appear as protecting one specific minority. It wanted to promote an inclusive dialogue. So it's a double-edged sword. That being said, to come back to more recent things, what happened this summer, it was again very obvious when there were in Sueda massacres of Druze. What happened on the Syrian coast, Alawi and other minorities all arrived in the Russian military bases saying, please protect us, we're about to be decapitated by the jihadists. The that are in power, the new Syrian authorities, as they're being called. So that's the image that they still portray, that they still have Russia protecting minorities. Is it still the case on the African continent? I would say maybe not. First of all, we have to focus on every region because this is not a homogeneous territory. And secondly, I would say that the situation isn't ripe for the Orthodox Church to promote its good offices, maybe in 3-4 years. Is someone here to bring the microphone to people in the audience? If not, I'll do it. Who wants to ask a question? We were able to see in detail how Russia was imposing itself on the African continent through the Orthodox Church, through training African priests, but concretely with Islam as well. Is it doing it with Islam? Your question is... Could you rephrase your question? I didn't fully understand it. How is Russia training imams as well, right, Igor? The answer will be short. For the moment, that is not the case. There are dialogues and interactions happening, but no specific movement because there are no such institutions in legitimacy. It's some very different organizations. So when it comes to that, for the moment, it's not pertinent. But for the Catholic clergy, or rather Orthodox, there's already a lot of mobility that's been installed. Igor can correct me because he knows Russia much more than I do, but the question you asked is interesting. It also raises the difficulty of positioning for Putin when it comes to the religion globally, and also the difficulty to define Russia. Russia is an Orthodox power. That's what he said several times recently, but he also reminded us that Russia was also a Muslim country. He said it several times. So the question of identity, of the link with religion, is a question that's raised within a state and has an impact on foreign policy, including, as is the case at the moment, when it stays informal. That's one of the cards that's being played by Russia frequently. Russia presents itself as a multi-faith in Russia. There are over 150 identities in Russia: Jews, Christians, Orthodox, Muslims, shamanists, animists, so many identities, including in Siberia. So Russia wants to promote in its narrative that it is a very diverse state, and it can work. However, the difficulty, and François, you've mentioned it, Putin is okay with Russia being very orthodox. Every time there's a baptism, he goes and plunges 3 times in an ice-cold bath every January, and sometimes it creates tensions internally in Russia because, as we've said, Russia is a multi-faith country. Someone wants to ask a question? Just by the time you get to the end of the room, I'm going to say this. I have a question. Can someone answer this question that I cannot personally answer? Is there a religious diplomacy in China? Internally, there's a Chinese policy of restricting freedoms, including religious freedoms and other types of freedoms. As far as I know, there is no such thing as religious influence in China. What I'm going to talk about is not specifically religious, but related. Just as in India, we see that Modi is insisting upon Hinduism, but also upon yoga. So there's a hard part of the religion, Hinduism, but also a soft part, as you've said, Igor, and it works as well for Russia. There's an external narrative that tries and portrays itself as softer and internally harder. So Modi has a soft narrative when he promotes yoga, India being a country of tolerance, even if internally the policies are actually very restrictive. In China, elements related to the Chinese culture, including Confucius's heritage, are appearing. You're going to tell me that's not religion. It's not religion, but it is an element that appears as a political cultural element. It's a political cultural policy or even spiritual policy that's being promoted. It depends on how we interpret this movement and how we interpret Confucius's ideas. I think that China has evolved. When we were small, when we were children, we all loved to go and watch Bruce Lee's films and Jackie Chan's films. I think that was a cultural work that they did at the end of the 80s, but also it was built on Confucius's ashes that were promoted in universities everywhere, and that was an excellent idea promoted by China. Some of Africa's elites at the moment are a vehicle for the economic strategy of China on the continent. So they did some work directly, not so much on the religion, but on culture globally. There's a question at the back of the room. Hello, I had a question on Mali. We've seen for a few weeks, for a few months now, that there's been a lot of change in the southwest of the country, in the region of Kai, with the Jenim being very active in this region, led by Hayaka Khalil, who is one of the most powerful men in the region. How do you interpret the political and religious project of the Jenim at the moment? What's happening in the region of Kai? And what does it mean about their project? Is it still the same project? Has it changed? What do they want? Do they want Bamako to fall? And if that is the case, we said for a long time that the north was their zone of interest and that their caliphate project was about the north of the country only. Has it changed? Has it evolved? Why would they want to see Bamako fall, if they would? That is an excellent question. I said earlier that there were 3 zones. The north, of course, Drali controlling the Jenim, and is trying to present itself as a regulator. Let's not forget that the Jenim arrived after Serval and Barkhane operation. So Barkhane wanting to control Sahel, the response was the creation of Jenim. And now they've understood that. They had someone like Mamadou Koufa, who got ready very secretly, and they were able to promote, develop their culture, their doxa. So they have liberated Kidal, but there are other areas in the north, in Kidal and around Kidal. They are getting nearer to Kidal, and in the center of the country, the epicenter and the central delta, they have Tisti now under their control, and as they know how to do. They occupy the territory, they occupy the religion, they occupy the political power. I've talked about also the faiths in Bamako being in conflict, and they move forward and they test the waters. What's been happening? They've led a coordinated action unseen before, and they managed to set in turmoil the majority of the country and block the border with Senegal. Jenim has managed to find what they called free zones in the south of the country, and we've never seen this before. And what's happening at the moment? They've led an economic war, and that's their last resort, last strategy. I do not think they will seize Bamako. I really do not. But people are scared in Bamako. Some people have started leaving the capital, even myself. This morning I was looking up whether I could stay in this country for a while or not. So what's going to happen? They will not seize Bamako, but what they will do is they will strangle Bamako. What do I mean by that? They will follow in a way Taliban's approach. MINUSMA has left, Barkhane operation has left, and Russia at the moment is not able to fight. And now that they have drones, all the more so, drones that have gone through Ukraine, we do not have any proofs, but we're being told by experts that they have drones because all of their actions are being filmed. They have social networks on which they show everything they do. So they are able to create a conflict situation around the city of Bamako and force a negotiation to happen. And that negotiation will either lead to the departure of people in power or power shared with jihadists. So I do not have a clear response, but by December, something could happen that could really set Mali in turmoil.
Thank you very much. We must stop there. Sharp on time, as you can hear. So many thanks for those very rich exchanges.
Please enjoy your lunch break.